This video is brought to you by Paperlike. Welcome to a video I am super excited to share with you today, and I know the background is probably messy. I just finished up wrapping up an hour-and-a-half long monologue or top-down shot, which I'm going to condense for this exact video here, and by the time you're watching this, by the way, I'm either going to be A, passed out in bed, or B, at the grocery store with a freaking respirator on, but that's a story for a different video or a social media platform, so check my Instagram if you want to see details about that. But anyway, I'm getting back on track here. Welcome to my MacBook Air versus iPad Pro comparison. This will be my first and not my last. I plan on comparing the i5 variant of the MacBook Air to a 12.9-inch iPad Pro setup down the line, but in this video I want to compare the baseline i3 MacBook Air, which goes for $999 on Apple's website, to the baseline iPad Pro 11-inch with an Apple Pencil, which comes to around $930, hence this video's title. But before we get into things here, I would really appreciate it if you leave a like on this video, comment if you have any questions, suggestions, or opinions, as the YouTube algorithm likes that and will help push my content to more people. And if you are a recurring viewer, be sure to press the bell icon and enable all notifications. Okay, pardon my other iPad right here. It has my Google Doc where I have all my notes, so I know what the hell I'm talking about. And also, this keyboard will become relevant in a minute. First up, let's start off with design. And of course, these are two very different devices. This is a notebook or a laptop. This is a tablet. However, they do share the same build quality and aesthetic. Apple makes very premium looking and feeling devices crafted out of pretty much all metal and glass, with the exception of the plastic keyboard here found on the MacBook. And both are exceptionally thin and light. The MacBook Air really impresses me. I'm used to using a MacBook Pro 13-inch, and it's just so light, and I love the way it kind of tapers off at the end, like the original one that was launched in 2008. And then of course the iPad Pro, particularly in this 11-inch variant, is even more compact and portable. It comes in at just under 6 millimeters thick. It weighs just around a pound, and you can really slip this into a small bag, for example, when you're on the go. These devices also differ in regard to their biometric unlock methods. The MacBook Air, for one, uses Touch ID in the power button, whereas the iPad Pro makes use of Face ID in the bezel here, as you can see. Both are accurate, both are quick, and I have really no complaints for either of them. Next up, let's talk about built-in inputs here. And these being very different devices, of course, they're going to have differing inputs. The MacBook Air, for one, has a built-in keyboard, which is brand new, by the way. It is sort of like, if not identical to the keyboard found in the 16-inch MacBook Pro. They got rid of the butterfly switches and instead opted for a hybrid, like scissor and butterfly mechanism. This device also has a built-in multi-touch trackpad, which allows a fine point of input, whereas the iPad Pro, of course, by itself comes with nothing, and obviously you get a virtual keyboard. But one of the defining features of this tablet is the ability to attach an Apple Pencil 2nd generation right to it. This is what makes iPad Pro such a powerful device, because for me, for example, I'm a college student and I love taking notes in GoodNotes 5, so I can open up my calculus notes, for example, and as you can see, all the time, every day, I am writing something down with my iPad Pro and Apple Pencil. This is something you cannot do with the MacBook Air because it doesn't have a touchscreen and it doesn't have a place for you to put Apple Pencil, and even if it did, it'd be a weird experience. This device is meant for handwritten notes, and that's the way I use it. And of course, it's meant for artists as well who want to use apps like Procreate and Autodesk Sketchbook. This experience, once again, you just cannot emulate on the MacBook Air right out of the box. You have to buy accessories like a Wacom tablet and a Wacom pen, or maybe even an Apple Pencil and an iPad Pro to attach to it if you're so invested in the Adobe ecosystem, for example, if you need like Photoshop. So long story short, if you are an artist or a college note taker like I am, or just a note taker or somebody who likes writing handwritten notes, the iPad Pro is hands down the winner here because it just offers hardware the MacBook Air doesn't have. Just like the MacBook Air offers something the iPad Pro doesn't out of the box, and that is a keyboard and a trackpad experience. If you're somebody constantly typing up documents, emails, whatever, this device can do so, once again, right out of the box with this amazing full-sized keyboard with actual travel, and of course you get a trackpad built in. And macOS has had for the past decade a plethora of features and keyboard shortcuts to accommodate, you know, this sort of like writing-oriented workflow, and that is something the MacBook Air has been really good at for the past couple years. You see like English teachers and just people, you know, writers in general, loving this type of laptop. And of course, you can buy a keyboard with the iPad Pro. For example, I just bought the Smart Keyboard Case or Folio for my 12.9-inch iPad Pro here, and I've been loving it, but still, it doesn't replace the feeling of an actual keyboard, the experience of having a keyboard always there, ready to go. And also, the iPad Pro with the keyboard case, regardless of whichever size you have, is more uncomfortable in your lap. This is a laptop, so if you're going to be writing on the go all the time, constantly responding to emails, just if you're in need of a physical keyboard, obviously this device is going to be superior. And I will also mention iPad Pro or iPadOS in general can now support trackpad input, which is super cool. It's different than macOS, but still, it's very similar in some regards, and I'm really excited for it. And maybe this magic keyboard that Apple's going to launch in May is going to change the way iPad Pro works, but even still, I just can't see the iPad Pro and the iPad Pro experience and accessories eclipsing a macOS. People are just going to prefer it, and if you find yourself wanting a laptop operating system, then obviously go for the actual laptop. Another similarity and sort of difference lies in input, like actual I/O. We have a single USB Type-C port on the iPad Pro, which can accommodate external storage and such, whereas on the MacBook Air, we do have dual Thunderbolt 3 ports, which of course take the USB Type-C form factors. So technically they have the same kind of input. Of course, the MacBook Air has more powerful bandwidth with Thunderbolt and, ×2 for that matter. But regardless, both of these devices can accommodate USB Type-C adapters, which can allow you to adapt to USB Type-A, an SD card, and of course, allow you to directly copy files off of said media, even on an iPad Pro. And in the past, of course, we know iPads featured Lightning, which was slower and less adaptable and universal. So it's nice to see that both of these devices feature this input and of course this adaptability, although once again, the MacBook Air has 2 of these ports. And last up, I want to talk about speakers, and both of these devices pack really stellar speaker setups. We have dual stereo speakers with the MacBook Air that are updated and I'm sure tweaked to be sort of like the 16-inch MacBook Pro, although not as magnificent. And of course, as you know, we have a quad speaker setup with the iPad Pro. But before I make any assertions about the quality of the sound, I want to do a quick audio test with some non-copyrighted music so you can get a feel for things as well. So after testing this myself and actually asking people in my family just to make sure that I'm not making things up, I've concluded that the iPad Pro 11-inch does have an amazing speaker setup. It's loud, it's crispy. However, the MacBook Air just does a bit better of a job, outputting more volume and also maintaining clear highs and mids. So the speaker quality is superior with the MacBook Air. I would say the iPad Pro is about 85% as good as what this laptop can output, which is pretty good for a tablet, mind you. And of course, the iPad Pro 12.9 inch is going to be even better because it is a bigger tablet, which can allow sound to reverberate in there. And of course, I've told a couple people this in my audience, I will be comparing the 12.9 inch iPad Pro, a setup, with the keyboard and the pencil, with the i5 version of this MacBook Air. So stay tuned for that if you're interested. Next up, let's talk displays here. And the most obvious difference in this comparison is the screen size. We have a 13.3 inch display with the MacBook Air and an 11-inch display with this iPad Pro variant. Resolution and PPI are actually pretty similar, but are in favor of the iPad Pro here. The display with the MacBook Air has a resolution of 2560 by 1600 and a PPI of 227 compared to the iPad Pro, which has a resolution of 2388 by 1688 with a PPI of 264. And in regard to color and overall quality, they're the same. They use the same LED backlit tech, and they both have true tone color, which of course will adjust the display color to match the color tone of your room. But where things begin to differ are in the overall brightness output. You have a max brightness of 400 nits with the MacBook Air compared to 600 nits with the iPad Pro, and a 60 hertz max refresh rate with the MacBook Air, which is pretty typical for most, notebooks and laptops. And of course, a 120 hertz output or refresh rate with the iPad Pro. Apple calls that ProMotion, and it makes a world of a difference when you're writing and just interacting with the menus and the interfaces. It just makes for a buttery experience. I'm not saying the MacBook Air isn't smooth, it's just that the higher refresh rate just makes the iPad Pro feel even smoother, even if it technically isn't. So yeah, while display color and sharpness and contrast will be similar between these two devices, especially in regard to creative work, which is pretty important, the brightness and refresh rate qualities once again are skewed in favor of the iPad Pro. And in regard to display overall, I think the iPad Pro does offer a nicer experience. But I will quickly say here, even though the display is technically better on the iPad Pro, it is smaller with the 11-inch variant that we have here in this comparison. So having a bigger screen size at 13.3 inches will offer you more screen real estate and just more room to work with when you want to multitask, so you can have like a web page open and a textbook open more comfortably. And that's part of the reason why I actually prefer using a 12.9-inch iPad Pro, and that's a whole separate topic for a different video. But yeah, if you want more screen real estate and you could care less about the operating system and maybe you want the keyboard and the trackpad, then I would say go for the MacBook Air. But again, the refresh rate and the brightness are just superior here with the iPad Pro, even in the 11-inch form factor. Next up, let's quickly talk about battery life. And although I haven't done any in-depth testing myself, the MacBook Air should fare a bit better in regard to just, overall screen on time. And I'm looking directly at Apple's numbers because in my experience, they have been pretty accurate in, representing how well their devices perform throughout a day of usage. Apple rates the MacBook Air at 11 hours of web surfing versus the iPad Pro at 10 hours of web surfing. And I've also found as well that the iPad Pro will drain more slowly during intensive tasks, as the A12Z inherently is more, power efficient versus an Intel chip, regardless of if it's an i3, an i5, or an i7. It's less power efficient, and if you tax it, if you play a game, if you render a video, the device, particularly a laptop, is going to drain more quickly, and you're going to want to plug it in. So that is one distinction I have to say. If you're doing heavy duty tasks, you're going to want to keep the MacBook Air plugged in, and if that's a problem and you want to be more portable, then the iPad Pro might be the right device for your workflow. But before we continue with this video here, I want to quickly talk about today's sponsor. And they are a company that I am a huge fan of. This video, once again, is brought to you by Paperlike, a company that makes these incredible screen protectors that emulate a paper surface on your iPad Pro. So taking notes and drawing and sketching just feels incredible and a lot more intuitive and engaging than just the glossy glass screen on your iPad Pro or iPad, for example. These screen protectors are not just for iPad Pro, by the way. You can install them on the iPad Air 3 like I have right here, an iPad mini, iPad 10.2 inch, really any iPad that supports Apple Pencil, you can use a paper-like screen protector with. And on top of providing this paper-like texture, hence the name, it also has really excellent color fidelity because with these screen protectors, you do get a little bit of light refraction, but they have gotten this down to a science. The color quality and the display vibrance is still there, despite the fact that we have this really, intense screen protector installed here. So yeah, if you're somebody who uses your Apple Pencil a lot or takes a lot of notes with your iPad, I would definitely consider checking out a Paperlike and this screen protector. I'll leave a link in the video description if you're interested. Next up, let's quickly go over the camera setups here. And this is a very quick topic for MacBook Air because it features a single 720p front-facing camera. It might even be less quality. Long story short, it produces potato quality images, but it's good enough for FaceTime and Skype and whatever. It's not perfect, but it does the job. Versus with the iPad Pro, you have this magnificent dual camera setup. We have a 12 megapixel sensor with a flash and ultra wide, which is nice for getting more in the shot. And of course, we have a LiDAR detector, as you know, which helps with AR and just depth sensing, applications and such. And although I'm no avid iPad Pro photographer or videographer, the setup on here is very impressive. So much so, one time I actually shot and edited an entire video using only an iPad Pro 2018, which has a very similar 12 megapixel sensor, which offers similar video quality. So if you're interested in seeing just how capable the iPad Pro is, go ahead and watch that video, and also my recent 2018 versus 2020 iPad Pro camera comparison if you want to get a really good feel for this camera setup here. And of course, the iPad Pro monopolizes the camera category because the MacBook Air completely lacks this hardware right here. And I'll quickly talk about the front-facing camera as well with the iPad Pro. It offers a 7 megapixel resolution, which is so much better than whatever Apple put into here. And it also offers or makes use of the Face ID tech, which can allow portrait mode selfies, for example. So long story short, if you are in need of a high quality camera setup with your work device, there's no question buy the iPad Pro, because once again, the MacBook Air is not going to suit you in that regard. And finally, we arrive to the juiciest part of this comparison, where we're going to talk about the general hardware elements and of course, overall performance between these two devices. So first up, I want to talk about the available storage here. With the MacBook Air, the baseline i3 model, we get 250 gigabytes of storage approximately out of the box, versus with the baseline iPad Pro, we get 128 gigs out of the box. And of course, you can get the 256 gig version of the iPad Pro for $899 in the 11-inch variant, but that kind of defeats the purpose of this sort of price range comparison. So yeah, comparing these two devices, this iPad Pro setup and this MacBook Air, of course, if you want to store more media, like photos and videos and files, this device will of course suit you better. better as it has twice the amount of storage. And I say that disregarding every other, difference between these two devices. So keep that in mind. And also you can connect external storage. So it's not the end of the world if you do have a lower capacity iPad Pro. And it's also nice that iPad Pro no longer is sold in a 64 gig variant. I found that very limiting, especially if you want to do any kind of creative work. Talking about processors now, we have a dual core 10th gen i3 inside the MacBook Air here, the baseline one for that matter, compared to the iPad Pro's 8-core ARM processor, the A12Z, which has a base frequency of 2.49 gigahertz versus the base frequency of 1.1 gigahertz with the i3 here. So very impressive right off the bat with the iPad Pro. And also to quickly mention, the MacBook Air ships with 8 gigabytes of LPDDR4X out of the box compared to the iPad Pro, which has 6 gigabytes max regardless of which size or variant you buy. And also, if this even matters, the MacBook Air has Intel integrated graphics, Intel Iris Plus for that matter, with around 1536 megabytes or 1.5 gigs of video memory versus the iPad Pro, which just has an integrated 8-core GPU within the A12Z. And to finally address these benchmark scores or numbers here, in regard to single core performance, both of these devices are very similar. The MacBook Air scores 1073, the iPad Pro 1116, so everyday tasks should be similar in performance and smoothness regardless of the differences in hardware and of course the operating systems that these devices run, but multi-core scores are a world of a difference. The iPad Pro's A12Z nearly beats the Core i3 twice in multi-core scores, and this indicates that the iPad Pro can handle, more heavy-duty multi-core oriented tasks like gaming and video editing and such, but of course we're going to do a real-world test here just to see how true that really is. But before we do anything like that, I do have to say, while the iPad Pro may be more powerful, it does run iPadOS, and though it has become very capable itself as an operating system with, added trackpad input and external storage support, as I've said, and of course a file management system too, which it didn't have a couple years ago, the MacBook Air runs macOS, which can enable you to run the Adobe suite, including Photoshop and Final Cut, and it has an arguably superior file management system with Finder, and you can even run Windows off of an external drive or on the internal drive if you want it. So it is more oriented for professional users in that regard. And of course, the iPad Pro cannot run a full-fledged photo of Photoshop or Premiere or Final Cut for that matter, but it does have a plethora of great iPadOS alternatives like LumaFusion, for example, which we will jump into in a minute here, and of course Affinity Photo and Procreate and other great iPad apps that professionals do use as well. And I'll also add that pretty much any device can run Lightroom now, so if you're doing light photo editing, it really doesn't matter which device you have, both of them can run this amazing application. But I will go back to my point about, being able to run full-fledged Photoshop on the MacBook Air. This is super important for someone like me because I have to use Photoshop every day to make my thumbnails. I have to do a lot of manipulation of, layers and such. And even with the Core i3, the MacBook Air does this really, really nicely. It's not as fast as my 5K iMac with an 8-core processor, and I'm sure the i5 would benefit a Photoshop workflow a little bit, but the i3 in this device can handle, high-resolution images and filters and multiple layers just fine. I could do my Photoshop workflow on here, no problem. And if you're somebody who does work with Photoshop and you are considering these two devices at the sort of $1,000 threshold, then of course this is going to be your device. So just like the iPad in the camera category, the MacBook Air in a sense monopolizes the software game in a couple of ways because once again it can run the full Adobe suite, and if your workflow and your profession relies on these applications, there is no question the MacBook Air is the device you need to buy. But enough with me just telling you about these devices. I want to do a real world performance test between these two in regard to 4K editing. So I have Final Cut Pro open here with some 4K clips that you may or may not have already seen in this video, and I have the same clips loaded on my iPad Pro, which we're going to play back on both these devices at full resolution. So let's do that here. We'll first start out with the MacBook Air, and even at 4K, although I haven't done any edits yet, I am seeing no issues in regard to the playback. It's playing back at a full 30 FPS, and of course on the iPad Pro with its superior processor, the same can be said. Let's see if I can go full screen here. So yeah, 4K playback of raw footage seems to be a task both of these devices can handle. Now I'll do just a quick little edit, adjusting the exposure and the color of both these clips here with the software available. So I did it within Final Cut Pro, and now I'll do it with the iPad Pro here. This should emulate, adjusting a clip. So let's see now how these devices play this back. So we'll start off with the iPad Pro here with this edit that I did. It's not great, but it should emulate, once again, editing clips. and I'm seeing no playback issues with the iPad Pro at all. God, that is so overexposed, but I'll fix that on my Mac later on for this video. Let's try things out with the MacBook Air here. I'll adjust things a little bit more. I might even add a effect layers. I'll add the crisp contrast little effect here, and we'll play this back at full resolution in full screen. And this is where the Core i3 may struggle a little bit. Unlike the iPad Pro, which has a better, multi-core oriented processor, the Core i3 just isn't cut out for 4K editing, as you can see here, or playback. You have to kind of render things out. Maybe 1080p video editing might work out for this, or very minimal editing, which requires very little color grading. But obviously, you don't want to buy a Core i3 to do any heavy-duty video editing. The iPad Pro seems to be better suited in that regard. And with that said, let's do a render test where we render out this entire project. So I will export this project at 4K in H.264, I believe. So let's just change it to that. And then I will do the same here with the iPad Pro. So we'll do it to my photos. So let's export these projects and see which device finishes rendering first. All right, so the iPad Pro just finished, and the MacBook Air is only 42% of the way through its rendering, and that's kind of sad because Final Cut Pro is specifically designed to work with the hardware in here within this Mac, so we're gonna see just how much longer it takes with my stopwatch for this project to finish rendering. Okay, it was taking so long that I just started going on a TikTok binge, and then this thing popped up and I didn't have my stopwatch open and my camera battery died, but basically, plus or minus a couple seconds here, it took about 5 more minutes to render this project. So what does that tell us? Well, if you want to do any kind of 4K editing for a living, the iPad Pro is the obvious choice here. And although LumaFusion does lack some of the features found in Final Cut Pro like we used here, and of course Premiere Pro, which I assume would perform worse because it's not as optimized as Final Cut, LumaFusion will get the job done for sure. I've heard countless amazing things about it. The Apple Pencil also makes for a great fine point of input, and yeah, you can definitely have a really successful video workflow here. And since time is money, you're going to want to render things more quickly than not here, and the overall playback experience is better on the iPad Pro as well. So yes, in comparing the i3 dual core variant of the MacBook Air, I've yet to test the i5 quad core model, so stay tuned for that. The iPad Pro is just the superior device. So in this price range, I do recommend buying the iPad Pro 11-inch with the Apple Pencil. Even though it has less internal storage, you of course can get an external SSD and connect it via USB Type-C. And I have 2 more things I want to say here before we wrap things up with this comparison. Number 1, if you are a developer, although I've heard great things about iPad Pro and developing Swift or learning Swift and whatever, it appears that the MacBook Air will be the better device if you want to compile code and write a website, although I'm sure there are apps that are being developed to facilitate that workflow on iPad Pro. I would play it safe and go with an operating system that will accommodate your working needs. And secondly, in regard to gaming, although you can run, full-fledged Java Minecraft with the MacBook Air, or even with a Core i3 in CSGO and, Fortnite, for example, of course, the better experience is going to be with the iPad Pro, not only because it is a superior processor and I assume GPU, but you also have just a wider selection of games. For example, I was doing a gaming test the other day with my 12.9-inch iPad Pro 2020, and I had a lot of fun playing Minecraft, even in the iOS or iPadOS version. And of course, I had fun with Asphalt 9 and Call of Duty Mobile and, Oceanhorn 2 and other great titles within Apple Arcade as well. So yeah, gaming is definitely a superior experience with the iPad Pro for its powerful chip and of course for its, more portable quality and its support for controllers out of the box, like the Xbox controller that I bought specifically for my iPad. So finally, after shooting this comparison top-down footage monologue, whatever you want to call it, for the past hour and 40 minutes, I started at 11:50 p.m. It is now 1:33 a.m. and I have to get this video out by 10 a.m. Just fun stuff regardless. We get to our conclusion, and while I cannot at the end of the day definitely decide which device is right for you without sitting down with you and talking about your specific needs and stuff, of course the point of this comparison was to present to you the pros and cons and the strong suits and the weak points of both these devices. What I can say is that the iPad Pro, despite its lack of a desktop or laptop operating system, is a hell of a deal even with the Apple Pencil and other accessories, because the A12Z is just a a monster of a processor, and the iPadOS app ecosystem is just getting even better. And of course, trackpad support and other features like that make this device more and more of a laptop replacement as time goes on. And that about wraps things up here. I hope this video helps you out. If you have a sort of $1,000 budget to spend, I do recommend the iPad Pro to a lot of users. It really is an incredible value. But of course, the MacBook Air, even in its baseline i3 form, is valuable to some users as well for its keyboard and its amazing speakers, and of course its operating system being macOS, which is still superior in some ways to iPadOS. I would really appreciate it once again if you leave a like on this video, comment if you have any questions, suggestions, or opinions, and of course subscribe for more content like this. Stay tuned for a lot more MacBook Air and iPad Pro oriented content coming soon. And as always, I'm Noah, and I will catch you all in the next one.